Dust does not fall the same way on Australia as it does on Earth. It hangs longer in the thin air, turning slowly like something alive, and it was still hanging that morning when Daniel Voss climbed over a broken slab of rock and saw what was left of Marrow Ridge. He had been walking for 2 hours before he smelled the burnt mineral in the air. It was a smell he knew well, the smell of a demolition charge, sharp and metallic, the kind that clung to the back of the throat. His job was simple. He surveyed land ahead of the mining crews, checked the ground for soft spots, old caves, anything that could collapse under heavy machinery. He was not supposed to be near an active blast site. But the charge had gone off early, 3 days ahead of schedule according to his tablet, and nobody had told him. The ridge that used to be a wall of orange stone was now a wide crater filled with broken rock and torn ground. Daniel stood at the edge of it for a long moment, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. He had seen blast sites before. This one was different only because of the shapes scattered near the bottom of the crater. Round shapes, the size of large boulders, cracked open like eggs, because that is what they were. He climbed down carefully, boots sliding on loose stone, and counted 4 broken shells before he understood what he was looking at. A nesting ground, worm eggs. The company records he had access to said nothing about a nest here, which meant either the survey before him had missed it or someone had chosen not to write it down. Daniel did not know which was worse. He almost turned back right there. There was no reason to stay. The mining consortium would send a cleanup crew within the week to clear the site for equipment, and whatever had happened here was already finished. That was what he told himself as he turned to climb back out of the crater. Then he heard it, a small wet sound somewhere between a cough and a cry coming from behind a slab of broken rock near the crater wall. Daniel had never been close to a worm before. Nobody on the colony had, not really, not close enough to matter. They were creatures from the safety briefings, shapes in old photographs taken from a distance, warnings printed in red on the outpost walls. Stay clear of worm territory. Do not approach. Report sightings immediately. He had followed those rules his entire time on Australia without ever once needing to think about what a worm actually looked like up close. What he found behind the rock did not look like the warning posters. It was small, not much bigger than a large dog, with dark green scales that had not yet hardened into the thick plates of an adult. One of its front limbs was bent at a wrong angle, and it was pressed as flat against the stone as it could get, trying to make itself smaller than it already was. When it saw Daniel, it did not attack. It did not even try to run. It simply stared at him with eyes too old for something so small, and made that same small, wet sound again. Daniel crouched down slowly, the way he might approach an injured dog. Every rule on every safety poster told him to back away and call it in. He thought about doing that. He really did. But the creature in front of him was shaking, and its wing limb was clearly broken, and somewhere above the crater, the last of the blast dust was still drifting down like slow gray snow onto the shells of its brothers and sisters. He reached into his pack instead of his radio. He had a splint kit meant for his own hands, thin metal strips and quickset bandage tape, the kind of thing every surveyor carried in case of a fall. He worked carefully, keeping his voice low and steady the whole time, though he had no idea if the sound of a human voice meant anything at all to a creature like this. The hatchling flinched when he first touched the injured limb, a sharp, full-body flinch, but it did not bite, and it did not run. By the time he finished, the limb was bound tight enough to hold, and the hatchling had gone very still, watching him with those old, tired eyes. Daniel gave it half the water from his canteen because it looked like it needed it more than he did, and because some part of him could not simply walk away and leave it there among the broken shells. Then he stood, checked the crater one last time for any sign of an adult worm that might come looking, and started the long walk back toward his outpost. He did not look back. He told himself there was no reason to. The hatchling could not follow him, not with a leg like that, and even if it could, worms were wild animals, not pets, and pets were not part of his job description. He had 11 miles to cover before dark and a report to file about a nesting site that officially did not exist. He made camp that night in a shallow gully, out of the wind, and ate his rations in silence, the way he ate most meals since coming to Australia. The stars here were unfamiliar, scattered wrong compared to the ones back home, and he watched them for a while before finally lying down to sleep. It was the sound outside his tent that woke him a few hours later, a small, careful scraping sound like something dragging itself slowly across gravel. Daniel sat up, heart suddenly loud in his own ears, and unzipped the tent flap just enough to look outside. The hatchling was there, curled against the base of his tent, its bandaged limb tucked close to its body, 11 miles from where he had left it. It looked up at him and made that same small sound from before and did not move any closer, as if it were waiting to see whether he would send it away. Daniel sat there for a long time, looking at it, and it looked back at him, and neither of them said anything at all. A man can convince himself of almost anything at 4 in the morning, and Daniel spent that whole night convincing himself that the hatchling curled against his tent meant nothing at all. It had simply wandered in the same direction he had walked. Wild animals did that sometimes. By sunrise it would be gone, back toward the crater, back to whatever instinct told it to do next. He packed up his camp with that thought firmly in his head, and he did not look at the hatchling while he did it. It was still watching him when he shouldered his pack and started walking. He tried the river first. About 4 miles from his camp, the ground dropped into a wide, fast-moving stream too deep and too cold for something small to cross easily. Daniel waded through it himself, boots and all, and climbed out the other side soaked to the knees. He stood there for a long moment, watching the far bank, waiting. Nothing came. He told himself that settled it and kept walking and felt something in his chest that he did not want to name. He heard the splashing about 40 minutes later. The hatchling came out of the water shivering, dragging its bad limb, moving slower than before, but moving. It stopped a short distance from him and simply stood there, dripping, watching him with the same patient, tired eyes from the crater. Daniel swore under his breath and kept walking, faster this time. Hopping distance alone would do what the river had not. By midday he had left it behind twice more, once by cutting through a stretch of thorned brush he guessed would be too rough for small limbs, and once by simply walking through the night without stopping to rest. Both times, the hatchling found him again. Each time it looked a little more worn down, its steps a little less steady, but it never stopped, and it never came any closer than it needed to. On the third day, Daniel tried something different. He found a shallow den carved into a rock face, dry and sheltered from the wind, and he left half his remaining rations there along with the last of his water. He told the hatchling out loud, like a fool talking to a wild animal that could not understand a word of it, that this was as far as he could take it, that it needed to stay here, where it was safe, and let him go the rest of the way alone. The hatchling looked at the food. It looked at him. Then it turned and started walking in the same direction he was heading, leaving the rations untouched behind it. Daniel sat down on a rock and put his head in his hands for a long moment. He was not an emotional man, not anymore, not after 2 years alone on survey routes with nothing but a radio and a schedule to keep him company. But something about watching that small, broken-legged creature choose to follow him instead of eating a meal, it clearly needed cracked something loose in his chest that he had kept sealed shut for a long time. He gave up trying to lose it after that. It was strange, walking with company again. Daniel had grown used to silence, to the sound of his own boots on rock and nothing else. Now there was a second set of footsteps behind him, uneven and dragging slightly on one side, but steady in its own way. He found himself talking without meaning to, narrating the terrain the way he might for a partner, explaining why he chose one path over another, commenting on the weather, asking questions he did not expect answers to. The hatchling never spoke, of course. It could not, but it listened, or seemed to, tilting its head at the sound of his voice, watching him with an attention that felt sharper than any animal he had ever known. It never begged for his food, though he shared it anyway. It never wandered toward the small groups of survey markers and equipment sheds they passed along the route, the way a curious animal might. It stayed close to him and nothing else, as if the rest of the world simply did not interest it. What struck Daniel most, over those first few days, was what it flinched at. It did not flinch at him, not once, not even when he moved suddenly or raised his voice at a loose rock underfoot. But when a distant blasting charge went off somewhere far behind them, a routine clearing charge from another survey crew, the hatchling dropped flat to the ground and did not move for almost a full minute. its whole body shaking. The sound of his own equipment, his radio static, even the whir of his small drone scanner drew no reaction at all. Only that one sound, only the sound of a charge. Daniel started paying closer attention after that. He noticed how it kept its ruined limb tucked protectively close, how it never fully closed its eyes even when it slept, how it positioned itself each night not simply near him, but between him and the direction they had come from, as though standing a small, exhausted watch. He did not know enough about worms to understand what any of it meant. He only knew that whatever this animal had lived through, it had left a mark deeper than a broken leg. On the fifth night, sitting by a small fire with the hatchling curled a few feet away, Daniel found himself saying a name out loud without planning to. Rook. He was not sure where it came from, only that it fit, the way a name sometimes fits before you understand why. The hatchling lifted its head at the sound of his voice, ears, or the ridges where ears might be flicking slightly, and settled back down. Daniel looked at the small, watchful shape by the fire and realized, somewhere between one breath and the next, that he had stopped thinking of it as something he needed to get rid of. They had 285 miles left to walk, and for the first time since the blast site, Daniel was not entirely sure he minded. The land changed shape the further they walked, and so did the two of them. By the second week, Rook's limp had improved enough that Daniel removed the splint, though the leg still bent slightly wrong, a permanent reminder of the ridge. By then the hatchling had grown too, not by much, but enough that Daniel noticed it when they walked side by side, its shoulder now reaching almost to his knee. He had read once, in some outpost briefing nobody paid attention to, that worms grew fast in their first year and then slowed for decades after. He wondered, watching Rook stretch out in the morning sun, how big fast actually meant. The terrain between the ridge and the colony was not kind to travelers. There were stretches of broken canyon where the ground gave way without warning, wide flats where the wind carried grit sharp enough to cut skin, and one long night where the temperature dropped so low that Daniel built the fire higher than regulations allowed and did not care. Rook pressed close to him that night, not for warmth exactly. Daniel suspected worms ran warmer than humans anyway, but simply to be close. Daniel let it happen without comment. It was on the 17th day that they found the bones. Daniel spotted them first, a scattering of large ribs half buried in a dry riverbed, easily the size of his own forearm. He crouched to look closer and felt Rook go rigid beside him, every muscle locked tight, eyes fixed not on the bones but on the tree line beyond them. Daniel followed the gaze and saw it. An adult worm, easily 4 times Rook's current size even at a distance, standing motionless among the trees, watching them both. His first instinct was to run, and every instruction from every safety briefing screamed the same thing. Instead, he found himself standing very still, one hand resting lightly on Rook's back, feeling the small body trembling beneath his palm. The adult worm did not charge. It did not roar or posture the way the old warning photographs suggested. It simply watched, head tilted slightly, its attention moving between Daniel and the hatchling beside him with something that looked, uncomfortably, like consideration. Long minutes passed. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs the entire time, but he did not move, and neither did Rook. Then, without any warning, the adult worm turned and disappeared back into the trees, as silently as it had appeared. Daniel did not sleep well that night, replaying the moment over and over, trying to understand what he had seen. It had not looked at them like prey. It had not looked at them like a threat to chase off. It had looked at Rook the way, Daniel realized uncomfortably, a stranger might look at a child walking with an unfamiliar adult, weighing something, deciding something, before choosing to let it go. He did not have an explanation for it, and Rook, of course, offered none, but something about the encounter settled a question Daniel had not realized he was still carrying. Whatever Rook was doing by staying at his side, it was not simple animal confusion. Something about it made sense to another worm too, even if Daniel could not yet understand what. The days that followed fell into an easier rhythm. Daniel talked more than he had in years, filling the long walking hours with stories about Earth, about his life before the survey contracts, about a sister he had not spoken to in longer than he liked to admit. Rook listened the way it always listened, head tilted, eyes attentive, offering nothing back but presence. Daniel found that presence was enough. He had spent 2 years telling himself he preferred the silence of solo survey work. Walking beside Rook, he began to suspect he had only ever gotten used to it. He noticed other things too, small patterns he would not have caught if he had not been paying close attention. Rook never slept deeply, not once, always keeping some part of itself alert even in rest. It ate quickly, almost anxiously, as though food might be taken away before it finished. And every single time they passed the wreckage of old equipment, abandoned drilling gear or rusted survey posts left behind by earlier crews, Rook gave the metal a wide, careful berth, watching it the way a person might watch something that had once hurt them badly. Daniel began to understand, without anyone telling him outright, that Rook had not simply lost its family in an accident. Something about the way it reacted to machinery, to sudden loud sounds, to the metallic smell that clung to blast sites, suggested a memory sharper and more specific than mere instinct. He did not push the thought too far. He did not have the facts yet, and he was not the kind of man who liked guessing at painful things without proof. By the time they crossed the last dry canyon and the ground began sloping gently upward toward higher country, Daniel had stopped counting the miles in his head the way he had at the start. It no longer felt like a burden to carry, this long walk with an unexpected companion. It felt, strange as it was to admit, like the first thing in a long time that had given his days any real shape. On the 22nd day, standing atop a ridge that finally gave him a clear line of sight toward the horizon, Daniel spotted it. A thin gray smear of smoke rising in the distance, the unmistakable sign of the colony's processing stacks. Home, or at least the closest thing to it he had on this planet. He looked down at Rook, who had followed his gaze and gone very still, staring at the same distant smoke with an expression Daniel could not quite read. Caution, maybe, or something closer to dread. Daniel did not know yet how right that instinct would turn out to be. Word travels faster than a man can walk, and by the time Daniel reached the outer fence of the colony, the entire settlement already knew a worm was coming in with him. The gate guard saw them first, a young man Daniel barely recognized, who took one look at Rook padding along at Daniel's side and went pale before scrambling for his radio. Within minutes, the calm walk toward the colony gates turned into something else entirely. Voices shouted over one another. A small crowd gathered at a careful distance, some with weapons half raised, none of them quite willing to be the first to lower them. Daniel raised both hands slowly, placing himself between the crowd and Rook without fully deciding to do it. "It's not a threat," he called out, his voice rough from weeks of disuse in long conversation with anyone but a creature that could not answer back. "It's injured. It's a juvenile. It followed me from Marrow Ridge." The man who pushed through the crowd next wore the insignia of colony security, and Daniel recognized him immediately. Captain Silas Reed had run outpost security for as long as Daniel had been on Australia, a broad, steady man who took the safety of the colony seriously enough that he rarely smiled about anything. He stopped a careful distance away, hand resting on the weapon at his hip, eyes fixed on Rook, with the flat assessment of a man calculating risk. "Marrow Ridge is an active clearance zone," Reed said. "There's no record of a live nesting site there." "There is now," Daniel said, "or there was. The blast went off early. It killed the nest. This is the only one that survived." Reed's jaw tightened at that, though whether from the information itself or from what it implied about the mining schedule, Daniel could not tell. "It's still a wild predator species, Voss, full-grown. That thing could take a man's arm off in a single bite. I can't have it loose inside colony walls, whatever sad story it's got." "He's not full-grown," Daniel said, the word slipping out before he noticed he had chosen it, he instead of it, a small thing that felt suddenly important. "He's walked 300 miles on a broken leg rather than leave my side. If he wanted to hurt someone, he's had 100 chances." The standoff might have gone on longer if Dr. Wren Callahan had not arrived, cutting through the gathered crowd with the brisk efficiency of someone used to being listened to. She was the colony's only trained xenobiologist, a woman who had spent more hours studying distant worm sightings through long-range scopes than any other person on Australia, and who had been arguing for years, mostly without success, but the colony understood almost nothing about the species it kept building fences against. "Nobody is shooting anything until I get a proper look at it," she said, planting herself firmly between Reed and the small crowd. "Captain, you know as well as I do that killing a juvenile worm inside colony sightlines is exactly the kind of thing that could turn every worm within 100 miles hostile for a generation. We don't know how they communicate. We don't know what they remember. We are not finding out today." Reed did not look happy about it, but he lowered his hand from his weapon, if only slightly. "It gets contained," he said. "Secure enclosure, monitored at all times until we have a threat assessment. That's not a request, Voss." Daniel wanted to argue. Every instinct built over the last 3 weeks told him that locking Rook in an enclosure, alone, surrounded by unfamiliar humans and unfamiliar machinery, was exactly the kind of thing that would break something in the creature that had only just begun, cautiously, to trust him. But he also understood, watching the fear on the faces around him, that there was no version of this moment where a wild predator species walked freely into a human colony without consequences. "I stay with him," Daniel said instead. "Wherever he goes, I go. That's not negotiable either." Reed studied him for a long moment, then gave a short, tight nod, more out of practicality than agreement. The enclosure they found was an old equipment shed near the colony's edge, hastily cleared and reinforced, smelling of oil and rust in a way that made Rook's whole body go tense the moment they stepped inside. Daniel stayed close, keeping a hand on his back the way he had during the encounter with the adult worm on the trail, and slowly, gradually, felt some of the tension ease. Word of the situation spread through the colony within hours, and by evening, Governor Thomas Ellery himself had come to see the creature causing so much disruption. Ellery was a careful, measured man, the kind who weighed every decision against the mining consortium's expectations before his own, and Daniel had never particularly liked him, though he had never had much reason to dislike him either. "You understand the position this puts me in," Ellery said, standing just outside the enclosure fence, eyes on Rook rather than Daniel. "The consortium wants this land clear of worm activity, a juvenile wandering into colony grounds, alive, healthy enough to draw attention. That's not a story that helps anyone's timeline. There's a nesting site at Marrow Ridge that got cleared without proper survey," Daniel said. "That's the story that should be worrying you." Something flickered across Ellery's face at that, gone too quickly for Daniel to read clearly. "We'll discuss the ridge separately. For now, the animal's fate goes to a formal hearing. 3 days. Dr. Callahan will present her findings. Captain Reed will present his risk assessment. And you, Voss, will explain to a room full of frightened colonists exactly why they should trust the judgment of a man who walked 300 miles alongside a wild predator instead of calling it in." Daniel looked past him at Rook, curled tightly in the corner of the unfamiliar shed, watching the exchange with wary, exhausted eyes. "I'll be there," Daniel said. He did not yet know that the truth waiting to come out at that hearing would change far more than just Rook's fate. Dr. Wren Callahan did not sleep much over the next 3 days, and it showed in the dark circles under her eyes when she finally sat down across from Daniel in the colony's small records office, a stack of pulled files spread across the table between them. "I want to show you something before the hearing," she said. "I think you need to see it before anyone else does." She had spent the last 3 days doing 2 things at once, running every scan she could safely manage on Rook without causing him further stress, and digging through the mining consortium's survey archives for anything related to Marrow Ridge. The first task had gone smoothly enough. Rook was underweight, still healing, clearly traumatized by something, but otherwise a healthy juvenile with no signs of the aggressive tendencies the old warning posters insisted were universal to the species. The second task had taken longer, and what it turned up sat far heavier in the room than any medical scan could. Wren slid a printed page across the table. It was a survey report, dated nearly 2 months before the blast, listing Marrow Ridge as an active nesting ground. Confirmed sightings, egg counts, even a note recommending a minimum 18-month clearance delay to allow the current brood to hatch and disperse naturally. "This was filed," Wren said, "properly on record by the survey team before you, Somebody with clearance access buried it before the blast schedule went out. I checked the sign-off chain 3 times to be sure. It wasn't a mistake, Daniel. It was a decision. Clearing that site early kept the mining timeline on schedule, and somebody decided a live nesting ground wasn't worth the delay. Daniel stared at the page for a long moment, feeling something cold settle in his chest. He thought about the blast site, the cracked shells scattered across the crater floor, the smell of demolition charge still hanging in the air when he arrived. He thought about how close he had come to simply walking past it all without stopping. "They knew," he said quietly. "They knew," Wren confirmed, "and that's not even the part I wanted to show you." She pulled a second document from the stack, this one thinner, a behavioral study on worm juveniles compiled from limited field observations over the past several colony generations, mostly guesswork stitched together from long-range sightings and old records left behind by earlier survey teams. Most of what we know about worm social behavior is second-hand and incomplete. But there's a pattern here that keeps repeating across every account we have. Worm hatchlings imprint permanently on the first living creature that shows them protection or comfort during a moment of severe threat or loss. It's not simple animal instinct like a bird following the first moving thing it sees. It's deliberate. Worms appear to recognize kindness specifically, and they recognize cruelty just as clearly. Once that bond forms after traumatic loss, it does not break. Not through distance, not through time. Daniel sat very still, understanding beginning to form somewhere underneath the cold feeling in his chest. "You're saying Rook didn't follow me because he was lost." "I'm saying he followed you because, in the worst moment of his life, surrounded by everything he had ever known lying dead around him, you were the only thing that showed him mercy," Wren said gently. "Every account we have suggests that bond becomes the center of everything for a juvenile worm afterward, not simple attachment, something closer to the only reason left to keep going." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "He didn't walk 300 miles because he was confused, Daniel. He walked 300 miles because, as far as he understood his own world, you were the last good thing left in it." Daniel thought about the ridge, about the small, wet sound that had stopped him from climbing out of that crater, about 11 miles of desert crossed on a broken leg to reach a stranger's tent in the dark. He thought about a river crossed twice, thorned brush pushed through, food left untouched at a den because staying meant being left behind. He thought about every single time Rook had chosen to keep following him rather than take the easier, safer path, and understood, with a weight that nearly took the air out of his lungs, exactly what that choice had cost. "The company blast that killed his family," Daniel said slowly. "It's the same consortium I work for, the same markings on the equipment. Every time he flinches at machinery, at the smell of a charge, he's not just remembering an accident. He's remembering exactly who did this to him." Wren nodded, watching him carefully. "And you're the one exception he's found in all of it. The one human, wearing the same gear, working for the same company, who chose to help instead of walk past." She hesitated before adding the rest. "That's not something you can undo by handing him off to a containment program, Daniel. If that bond is what the records suggest it is, separating him from you now wouldn't just be cruel. It could genuinely break him." Daniel sat with that for a long moment, the printed survey report still open on the table between them. The truth of the buried nesting ground sitting alongside a truth far more personal and far harder to hold. Somewhere across the colony, in a converted equipment shed that still smelled faintly of oil and rust, Rook was waiting, the way he had waited at every camp, every river crossing, every long night on the trail, for the one person who had shown him that not everything wearing a human uniform meant harm. "The hearing's tomorrow," Daniel said finally, gathering the documents carefully into a single stack. "I need copies of both of these, all of it, the survey report and the behavioral study." Wren studied him for a moment, then began pulling the files together without another word. Daniel walked back toward the equipment shed that evening with the weight of everything he now understood pressing on his chest, and when Rook lifted his head at the sound of familiar footsteps, ears or the ridges where ears might be flicking with quiet, exhausted relief, Daniel sat down beside him in the dust, and for the first time since the ridge, let himself fully feel exactly how much that small act of trust had always meant. The colony's meeting hall had never held so many people at once, not for a harvest report, not for a supply shortage, not even for the founding ceremony Daniel vaguely remembered attending years ago. Every bench was filled, and more colonists stood crowded along the back wall, all of them there to decide the fate of a creature most of them had only glimpsed from a distance through a chain-link fence. Governor Ellery opened the hearing from the front of the room, flanked by Captain Reed on one side and an empty chair reserved for Dr. Callahan on the other. Reed spoke first, laying out his risk assessment in flat, careful terms, the same argument he had made at the gate 3 days earlier. A predator species, unpredictable growth, no long-term precedent for coexistence. His points were reasonable, delivered without exaggeration, and Daniel watched the crowd nod, along with more of them than he liked. Wren spoke next, presenting Rook's medical assessment, his healing injuries, his lack of any aggressive behavior across 3 days of close observation. It was solid, careful work, and it shifted a few faces in the crowd toward uncertainty. But Daniel could see it was not enough on its own. Fear does not move easily, even against good evidence, and every person in that room had grown up believing worms were simply something to be feared. When Ellery finally called Daniel forward, the room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it expects to be disappointed. Daniel had never been a man comfortable speaking in front of crowds, and standing there at the front of the hall with every eye in the colony fixed on him, he felt the old instinct to keep things simple, to say only what was safe and sit back down. But he thought of Rook, waiting in that shed with the smell of oil and rust, flinching at sounds no other creature in the colony would even notice, and he found he could not make himself say anything small. 3 weeks ago, I found a nesting ground at Marrow Ridge, he began, already cleared by a blast that wasn't supposed to happen for another 3 days. He held up the survey report Wren had given him, the page catching the light of the hall's overhead lamps. This was filed almost 2 months before that blast. It confirms an active nest. It recommends an 18-month delay to let the brood hatch and disperse safely. Somebody with clearance access buried this report to keep the mining schedule on track. A murmur moved through the crowd, and Ellery's expression tightened, though he said nothing yet. The worm in that shed right now is the only survivor, Daniel continued. He watched his entire family die under equipment marked with the same company logo every one of us wears on our own gear. He is not confused. He is not simply lost. Dr. Callahan's research shows worm hatchlings imprint on the first creature that shows them protection after a moment like that, and once that bond forms, it does not break. He didn't follow me 300 miles by accident. He followed me because, in the worst moment of his life, I was the only thing in his entire world that didn't hurt him. The hall had gone very still. Daniel looked out at the faces watching him, some still uncertain, some clearly moved, and pushed forward through the part he had been dreading most. "We can lock him up out of fear," he said. "We can treat him like every warning poster on this colony's walls says we should, or we can be the first humans on this planet who choose to be exactly what he already believes we're capable of being, because he already trusted us once when he had no reason left to trust anything wearing a human face. That's not nothing. That's not something we get to waste." Silence held the room for a long moment after he finished. Then Governor Ellery, looking older than he had at the start of the hearing, rose slowly from his seat. "The buried survey report changes the nature of this hearing considerably," he said, his voice careful but firm. "I will be opening a formal inquiry into the Marrow Ridge blast timeline, effective immediately." He turned toward Daniel, something unreadable in his expression. "As for the juvenile, given the medical assessment, the behavioral research, and the circumstances you've described, I'm not willing to authorize destruction of the animal. Containment protocols will be lifted." A ripple of surprised murmurs spread through the hall, some relieved, some clearly unhappy, but nobody rose to argue against the governor's decision outright. Ellery was not finished. "This colony has no precedent for what comes next, Voss, and precedent is exactly what a decision like this will require. Effective immediately, you will serve as this colony's first liaison to the worm population in this region. Understand that this puts a great deal of responsibility on you personally, both for the animal's conduct and for whatever relationship this colony builds with his kind going forward." Daniel looked toward the back of the hall, where Wren stood near the door with the faintest trace of a smile, and thought of Rook waiting patiently in that shed, unaware that his entire fate had just shifted in a room full of strangers arguing on his behalf. "I understand," Daniel said. Months passed after that, and the colony slowly grew used to the sight of Daniel walking its perimeter with a worm at his side, a worm that had grown considerably larger, though never once aggressive, never once giving the colonists reason to regret the governor's decision. The formal inquiry into Marrow Ridge led to real changes in survey protocol, changes that Daniel made sure were enforced properly this time. One evening, months later, standing at the edge of the tree line near the outpost, Daniel watched Rook approach two wary adult worms that had kept their distance from the colony for as long as anyone could remember. There was no fighting, no posturing, only a long, careful moment of study, worm to worm. Before the adults finally lowered their guarded stance, just slightly, in a way that Wren later confirmed matched nothing recorded in any prior colony report. Daniel stood quietly at the tree line and understood, watching it happen, that the greatest thing his species had ever built on this planet was not the mining equipment, not the outposts, not the survey routes carved carefully across the wilderness. It was this, one small act of kindness offered without any expectation of return that had walked 300 miles to prove itself worth remembering.